It was just an ordinary flight until Maya Thompson, a black businesswoman, took her VIP seat in 1A. Moments later, a white passenger insisted Maya didn't belong there. The flight crew didn't defend her, they turned to Maya, asking her to move, to make things easier. Humiliated and singled out, Maya stayed calm. She made one call, just one, and everything changed. What happened next left everyone stunned and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. There are moments in life when the truth reveals itself not as a blazing fire but as a whisper, low, persistent, and undeniable. Amara Hayes had lived long enough to recognize those moments. It was the kind of truth you saw in narrowed eyes that lingered just a little too long, in voices that hardened when they didn't need to. It lived in the air between two people who shared nothing but a glance and everything unspoken beneath it. The airport, sterile and indifferent, hummed with movement. Footsteps tapped a rhythm on polished floors. Flight announcements echoed faintly, and every now and then, a strained voice asked, "Can I get an upgrade?" Amara smiled to herself as she sat quietly in the lounge, clutching her leather-bound notebook, a ritual of hers filled with ink-stained ideas that had taken her from humble beginnings to where she sat now, a woman of substance, of stature. Her mother would have called her blessed. Her father would have called her determined. The years had taught Amara patience. But patience, she knew, was not the same as forgiveness. Across the way, Amara noticed her, an older white woman, Clara Widman, the kind whose presence seemed cultivated, like a prized plant tended for decades. Clara's pale fingers rested delicately on the handle of a designer tote. Her platinum hair swept back with meticulous precision. Everything about her screamed importance. Not earned, but inherited, her comfort and unspoken demand rather than a privilege. For a moment, their eyes met. It wasn't a look you could explain outright. Words always failed. It was the glance of someone cataloging Amara, measuring her worth, determining the weight of her presence in this space. Clara looked away first, disinterested, but the quiet judgment lingered. Amara tilted her head slightly, her face unreadable. "They're boarding early today," someone muttered nearby. Amara rose and made her way to the gate, her heels clicking with deliberate rhythm, each step an assertion of her belonging, though she wished it weren't necessary. The line for first class was short, as it always was. Businessmen with expensive watches and women draped in silk moved with unconscious ease. Amara waited her turn. At the counter, the young agent looked up, a white man in his mid-30s with a name tag that read Tom. His smile was tight but polite, his professional mask slipping slightly when his gaze landed on her ticket. "First class?" he asked, though the words weren't quite a question. Amara didn't flinch. "That's what it says." "Of course," Tom replied, recovering. "Enjoy your flight." And there it was, the whisper. Nothing you could write a complaint about. Nothing anyone would admit. Just a flicker in his voice. The smallest pause that said, "How did you end up here?" Amara held her boarding pass as though it were a shield and moved toward the jet bridge. The air suddenly too still. The first-class cabin was nearly empty. A world apart from the crowded economy rose where voices mingled and elbows clashed. Here, there was space. Luxury soft leather seats. Glasses already polished. Blankets folded with care. It was not a place Amara had ever expected to find herself when she was young. Yet here she was. She had earned this. Settling into seat 1A. Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The window beside her framed a world of endless possibilities, a streak of tarmac, the promise of motion, the deep orange glow of the setting sun. "Comfortable?" The flight attendant's voice startled her, a young man, probably in his 20s, with a practiced smile. His name tag read Greg. "I'm fine, thank you," Amara replied. Greg lingered just a little too long, as though checking for some irregularity. Before moving on, a whisper. She thought again. Amara opened her notebook, a comforting weight in her hands. She wrote nothing at first, just stared at the clean, empty page. The cabin filled gradually. A man with silver hair stowed his briefcase in the overhead bin. A couple slid into their seats, speaking softly to each other. And then Clara Widman appeared. Clara didn't so much step into the cabin as she entered, carrying herself with the weight of someone who had always been allowed to take up space. Behind her trailed a nervous-looking woman, a friend? A follower? Amara couldn't quite tell. Clara paused just inside the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the rows. Amara felt it the moment Clara saw her. A slight pause in her step, her brows knitting together, her mouth parting as though she meant to say something but thought better of it. Amara watched, silent and still. There was no mistaking the question in Clara's eyes. What is she doing here? The moment passed, but not really. Clara's voice rose in whispers, sharp and clipped, just loud enough to carry across the cabin. Are you sure this is right? Seat 1A? Yes, ma'am. Greg's voice responded quietly. Well, that's ridiculous. Let me see your list. Amara didn't turn her head, though every word reached her ears. Instead, she lifted her pen and began to write nothing in particular. Just a quiet act of resistance. A line, a curve. They don't get to decide where I sit. The murmurs faded, but Clara's indignation lingered like perfume in the air, sickly sweet and impossible to ignore. Amara smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. She had been here before, in one form or another. It wasn't about the seat, not really. It was about the air around her. The unspoken tension that came with people like Clara Whitman seeing people like Amara Hayes and asking themselves, why are you here? But Amara already knew the answer. She had fought to be here. And fight. She thought she would. It was not the big things that undid you, it was the small ones. The 1,000 tiny cuts, so subtle that they might have been imagined. Except they weren't. Amara Hayes had learned to carry them as a woman carried scars, silently. Without ceremony. Without permission. Seated in 1A, her mind wandered back to her mother's voice. When you enter their spaces, remember you belong there. You fought to get there. You owe them nothing but your presence. Her mother had said it softly, with the resignation of someone who had never gotten a seat at the table herself. But Amara was here now. And that was the problem, wasn't it? Her being here calm, steady, and unyielding was enough to disturb people like Clara Whitman. The sound of heels tapping against the carpeted aisle broke Amara's focus. Clara's voice, cool but rising, floated toward her like a breeze laced with ice. There must be a mistake, Clara said to Greg, the flight attendant. Her words were clipped, but they carried an edge of entitlement so sharp it could have cut glass. Ma'am, we've confirmed your seat. You're in 3B. Clara tilted her head, narrowing her eyes at Greg as though he were an insubordinate child. That's not acceptable, Clara snapped. I'm a Platinum Elite member. I always get seat 1A. Greg shifted, his polished demeanor faltering. He cast a glance toward Amara, who remained motionless, her pen poised over the notebook as though it might anchor her in the storm gathering around her. Miss Hayes is in seat 1A, Greg said quietly. Clara turned her gaze toward Amara. She looked at her, not at the person. Not at the woman but at the intrusion. Amara felt it before Clara even opened her mouth. It was an old, familiar thing, passed down from generation to generation. Polished and rehearsed. Clara's smile was cold when it came. Excuse me, dear, she said. That dear held the weight of every slight Amara had ever endured. Are you sure this is your seat? Amara looked up then, slowly, deliberately. She met Clara's gaze with the same quiet, formidable steadiness that had made grown men fold across boardroom tables. Quite sure, Amara said softly, her voice smooth but immovable. Clara's smile faltered, her cheeks coloring slightly. It's just that, I always sit there, she said, as if that explained everything. Surely the airline can sort this out. She turned to Greg again. This time her voice edged with steel. I don't see why I should be inconvenienced. Greg hesitated. It was a moment Amara had seen too many times. A line had been drawn, faint but definite, between two women, the black woman who had already paid for her right to be here, and the white woman who couldn't fathom it. Amara could see Greg standing at that line, uncertain which way to step. Ma'am, he said carefully, turning to Amara now, would you be willing to move to seat 2C? It's still first class, and it would make things easier. Make things easier. Amara sat very still. The words settled over her like a weight, familiar and suffocating. She looked at Greg, her gaze steady and clear. Easier for whom? Greg blinked, flustered. It's just, it would resolve the situation. The situation, Amara repeated, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. I don't see a situation. Greg, I see a woman who doesn't want me here. I see you asking me to move to make her comfortable. Tell me, Greg, why do you think that is? Greg's mouth opened, but no words came. The air in the cabin grew thick. Amara could feel the other passengers listening, pretending not to. Some stared down at their magazines, others out the window, but the truth hung in the air like a stench no one wanted to name. Clara took a step closer, her voice sharp now. "You don't have to make this difficult. I'm not the one making this difficult," Amara replied, still calm. The silence stretched. Clara's lips tightened as though holding back the words she really wanted to say. Words that had no place here but lived beneath everything she had said so far. The anger rising in her eyes was not just about the seat. It was about the audacity of Amara Hayes existing in a space Clara thought was her birthright. Greg glanced down the aisle, looking for support. From the back of the cabin, the flight supervisor, Deborah Lane, approached. She was middle-aged, composed, her posture stiff with the authority she wore like armor. "Is there a problem here?" Deborah asked. Clara turned to her like a drowning woman reaching for a rope. "Yes, there's been a mix-up. I'm supposed to be in seat 1A. Deborah nodded, her eyes shifting to Amara. There it was again, that hesitation. That flicker of doubt that Amara knew all too well. "Miss Hayes?" Deborah said. "Would you be willing to?" Amara cut her off. No. The word was not shouted. It did not need to be. It landed like a stone, reverberating in the space between them. "I paid for this seat," Amara said. "I reserved it weeks ago. I am staying in this seat. If there's an issue with Mrs. Whitman's seat, then perhaps you should address it with the airline." For the first time, Deborah looked uncomfortable. She glanced at Clara, who stood frozen, her anger bubbling beneath her skin. "Mrs. Whitman," Deborah said carefully, "perhaps we can move you to another seat." Clara's face flushed red. "I am not moving. I'm a loyal customer. I don't see why she has a name," Amara said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp, as though someone had punctured the air. Deborah cleared her throat, her voice faltering for the first time. "Let me check with the captain." As Deborah walked away, Clara turned back to Amara. Her voice was low now, almost a hiss. "You don't belong here." Amara tilted her head, a small, faint smile on her lips. "Oh, I think I do." The words hung there between them, two women locked in a battle that neither would name. But both understood. Around them, the other passengers held their breath, waiting, watching, as though the outcome mattered to them too. And perhaps it did. Amara leaned back in her seat, her notebook still open on her lap, and said nothing more. She didn't need to. She had spoken the truth. The rest would take care of itself. There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than sound. A silence like that does not creep, it descends. It is born not of peace but of power, inspoken and wielded, leaving no room for the truth to breathe. Amara Hayes sat in seat 1A, and in that thickening silence, she knew exactly what was happening. It was in the way Clara Whitman stood with her arms crossed just a few rows away, her lips pinched tight. It was in the way the flight supervisor Deborah Lane had left to speak with the captain, her polished shoes clicking with the kind of purpose that said more than her words ever could. And it was in the way the other passengers, men in tailored suits, women holding designer bags, suddenly became absorbed in magazines they hadn't touched until now. Amara could feel them watching, pretending not to. She had felt this weight before. It followed her into elevators where no one spoke, into hotel lobbies where someone always asked if she was lost, into boardrooms where men in gray suits wondered aloud if she belonged in the conversation. But today, it wasn't some glass ceiling abstraction. Today, it was a seat she had paid for. And still, here they were. Greg, the young flight attendant, hovered by the galley. He wasn't watching Amara directly, but she could see his discomfort in the restless way he shifted his weight. Fiddling with his tie, Greg was caught suspended between two worlds he didn't understand, between a system he was paid to serve and a woman who had dared to demand her due. "Is this still going on?" a voice called from behind. A white man, somewhere in his 60s, Mr. Jameson, Amara thought she heard him say earlier, spoke loudly from his seat in 2B. His tone lined with irritation. "Why don't they just fix this and get on with it?" Amara didn't turn, but her jaw tightened. She could feel the current shifting. His words had not been addressed to her, but she was the subject nonetheless. Clara seized her moment. She stepped into the aisle, her voice now loud enough to command attention. "I'm sorry, but I just don't see why this is a debate," she said, her gaze flickering briefly to Amara and then away, like one might regard a problem better left to someone else to solve. "I've flown this airline for years. I always sit in this seat. And now," she trailed off, her hands lifting slightly, as though even explaining the injustice of it all was beneath her. It was a performance, Amara realized, so carefully rehearsed that Clara herself might not recognize it as one. The indignation was real enough. She had always sat here. That alone seemed proof enough of her right. And what was Amara, then? The mistake? Deborah returned with an air of quiet authority that wasn't fooling anyone. Her eyes darted toward Amara before settling on Clara, whose impatience had blossomed into righteous anger. "Mrs. Whitman," Deborah said softly, like a mother calming a child, "I've spoken with the captain. There's nothing more we can do. The seat assignment stands." Clara's face froze for just a moment, her control slipping before the anger returned. "That's absurd," she hissed. "You mean to tell me that you're choosing her comfort over mine? After all the money I've spent with this airline? Her comfort." The words struck Amara like an accusation, a suggestion that she didn't belong here on her own merit but had somehow stumbled into a privilege meant for someone else. Deborah turned toward Amara now. And there it was again, the ask, faint but present in her posture. In the apologetic tilt of her head, Deborah's voice was smooth, practiced, but it carried that same unspoken request. "Miss Hayes, I understand you've paid for this seat. But perhaps—" "No." The word came out sharper this time. Before Deborah could finish, Amara's voice was steady, unyielding, but beneath it, the fire smoldered. "No," Amara repeated, "and before you ask again, I'll remind you that the problem is not mine to solve." Deborah hesitated, clearly unnerved. "I'm just trying to—" "To what?" Amara interrupted. "To make her comfortable?" The words cut through the air like a knife. Deborah's eyes darted around nervously, as though searching for an exit. But Amara wasn't letting her off the hook. "Let me make this plain for you," Amara said, her voice calm, deliberate. "I bought this seat. I earned it. I'm not moving because a woman who looks like Mrs. Whitman believes I don't belong here." The silence that followed was thick with discomfort, the kind that made people shift in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their seatbelts or in-flight menus. For the first time, Clara seemed unsure of herself. She opened her mouth, closed it, then found her footing again. "I never said you didn't belong here," Clara said tightly. "You didn't have to," Amara replied. Clara's face flushed crimson. Mr. Jameson, still seated in 2B, muttered loudly, "Unbelievable. This is why flights are delayed." Amara turned her head then, slowly, meeting his gaze. "No, sir," she said softly. "Flights are delayed because people refuse to let others exist where they don't expect to find them." Mr. Jameson blinked, clearly unused to being spoken to so directly. He looked away, his irritation faltering into silence. The moment hung there, brittle and sharp, until the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are finalizing preparations for takeoff. Please remain seated and ensure your belongings are secure." Deborah stepped back then, her face a mask of polite neutrality, though Amara could see the unease in her eyes. She offered Clara a tight smile. "Please take your seat, Mrs. Whitman." Clara opened her mouth as if to protest one last time but found no audience willing to listen. With a sharp intake of breath, she turned, the sound of her heels striking the floor like punctuation to a battle she had lost. Amara exhaled quietly, though the fire in her chest still burned. She turned back to her notebook, pretending to write though the pen remained still in her hand. The cabin settled around her. But nothing was settled at all. The whisper had grown louder. And Amara knew, as she always had, that there would be more whispers before the day was done. It had been said that the world was not built for people like Amara Hayes, people who stood in spaces where they were not expected, not wanted, and dared to stay. The world's cruelty, after all, was rarely explicit. It did not scream, it whispered. It did not hit, it leaned. It did not confront, it suggested, politely but firmly, that you step aside, give up your seat, fold yourself smaller, as though your very existence were an inconvenience to those who never imagined you could sit beside them. The plane began to move, the faint shudder of the wheels rolling along the tarmac vibrating beneath Amara's feet. Outside the window, the lights of the runway blurred into streaks of gold as the evening sky deepened to indigo. For a moment, Amara allowed herself to believe that the matter was settled. Clara Whitman, now seated in 3B, had fallen silent, though the energy radiating from her was unmistakable. But silence, Amara knew, could be its own weapon. The flight attendants moved methodically through the aisles now, performing their pre-flight duties. Amara watched them with an air of detached calm, but she felt the tension swirling around her like smoke. Greg passed by again, his expression guarded, his eyes avoiding hers as though she were a source of heat he could not bear to approach. When he reached Clara's row, he stopped, bending slightly to speak with her. Their words were low, almost conspiratorial, but Amara heard the unmistakable cadence of Clara's voice. "You need to do something about this," Clara said, not bothering to hide her frustration. Greg nodded, murmured something too faint to hear, then straightened and continued down the aisle. As he passed Amara's seat, he glanced at her briefly, just a flicker of a look, and for an instant, Amara saw it. Guilt. He was young, after all, young enough to still be learning how to navigate the world's quiet expectations. The way it trained you to recognize who to favor and who to question, who to defend and who to doubt. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. Moments later, Greg reappeared with a tray of drinks. It was the sort of gesture meant to soothe tensions, to restore calm in the cabin. He offered the tray to Clara first, bending low to whisper something that made Clara nod, her lips curling into a self-satisfied smirk. Then Greg turned to Amara, his voice light but forced. "Miss Hayes, would you care for a drink?" Amara looked at him steadily, her eyes sharp, unmoving. There it was again, that undertone, faint but present, as though the drink were not just an offer but a peace treaty, a silent plea for compliance. She shook her head. "No, thank you." Greg hesitated as though surprised. "Are you sure? We have champagne, if you'd like." "I said no." Greg straightened, his face carefully neutral, but Amara could see the tension in the way his jaw tightened. He turned quickly and moved down the aisle, and though nothing had been said, Amara felt it. The air had shifted again. The lines were being redrawn. 15 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed, casting everything into a soft glow. Around Amara, the passengers settled into their routines, some scrolling through tablets, others flipping pages of glossy magazines. But peace, Amara thought, was a privilege she was rarely afforded for long. From behind her came the faint, unmistakable sound of Clara's voice, low, sharp whispers that carried through the hush of the cabin. "I'm telling you, it's absurd," Clara said. "People like her always think they can push their way in and take whatever they want." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Amara's hand froze mid-page, her pen poised just above the paper. The cabin had grown quieter somehow, as though everyone had heard Clara's words but pretended they hadn't. Clara's companion, seated beside her, muttered something in response, a faint attempt to calm her, but Clara was not to be placated. "This is what happens when you let anyone buy a seat in first class," she continued, louder now. Amara closed her notebook, slowly, deliberately. When she turned, her gaze landed on Clara like a blow. The older woman flinched, though she quickly recovered, her expression stealing into something close to defiance. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Whitman?" Amara asked softly. Clara hesitated, clearly unprepared to be confronted so directly. "I wasn't speaking to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Amara said, "but you were speaking about me." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers who had spent the last hour pretending not to notice now looked openly, their eyes darting between the two women. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, then forced out a sharp laugh. Brittle and empty. "You're imagining things," she said. Amara tilted her head, studying her. "Am I?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. And Clara looked away, her face flushed. The flight supervisor, Deborah Lane, appeared again as if summoned by the rising tension. She approached with the careful, overly polite tone of someone who wanted nothing more than to restore order without asking too many questions. "Is everything all right here?" Deborah asked, though her eyes lingered on Amara longer than they should have. Amara turned to her slowly. "You tell me, Ms. Lane." Deborah blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry? Is there a reason Mrs. Whitman feels comfortable making comments about who belongs here?" Amara's voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire cabin. Deborah's eyes flickered nervously toward Clara, then back to Amara. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." Amara smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. No misunderstanding, just truth. The words hung there, unmistakable and undeniable. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confidence cracking at the edges. Deborah glanced around, clearly out of her depth. Perhaps we can all just focus on having a pleasant flight, Deborah said weakly, as though peace could be negotiated with silence. Amara said nothing more. She turned back to her seat, opened her notebook again, and let the tension settle around her like armor. She knew Clara would not stop. Not really. She also knew that people like Clara rarely acted alone. They were bolstered by a system, by unspoken rules that held more weight than words ever could. But Amara had spent her entire life surviving those rules. She had survived worse than whispers, worse than stares, worse than a woman like Clara Whitman thinking she could unravel her with a single thread of venom. And so Amara leaned back in her seat, her expression calm and unreadable, and waited, because there was no peace in silence, only the illusion of it. The truth was already making itself known. The mind will tell you that things are under control even when the body knows they are not. The illusion of peace, of stability, is maintained only so long as no one speaks too loudly, or moves too suddenly, or challenges what everyone else has agreed to leave unsaid. But Amara Hayes had shattered that silence. She knew it, and so did everyone else. The airplane cabin's soft leather seats, quiet hum of engines, polished surfaces that reflected faint, warped versions of the world now felt like a stage. She had taken her role without asking permission, and the audience did not know what to make of her. In seat 3B, Clara Whitman fidgeted with her bracelet, her jaw set, her eyes darting toward Amara like a storm gathering over the horizon. A woman like Clara did not lose often. She was not used to being ignored, let alone defied. And Amara, silent, unbothered, unmovable, was an affront that she could not forgive. It began small, as it always did. The hum of whispers, sharp and deliberate, carried just loudly enough for Amara to hear but too faint for anyone to intervene. Clara leaned toward her seatmate, the companion whose presence had been reduced to a nodding silhouette. "I can't believe how rude some people can be," Clara murmured, her voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Thinking they can act however they please. As if rules don't apply to them." Amara didn't turn. She didn't need to. The words found their way to her, settling in her lap like something dirty, something that would stain her hands if she picked it up. But Clara was not content to linger in the shadows. Women like Clara rarely were. The next moment, she pressed the call button, the sharp chime echoing through the cabin like an accusation. Greg, the young flight attendant, reappeared almost immediately, his face carrying the weariness of someone forced to referee a game he no longer wanted to play. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked, his voice careful. Clara tilted her chin, her tone sweetened with forced politeness. "I'd like to file a formal complaint. I don't feel safe sitting near someone who's been so hostile." The words dropped like stones into the cabin's still waters. Heads turned subtly, eyes flickering toward Amara before darting away again. It was Clara's voice, not her words, that made them listen. The veneer of civility still covered the ugliness underneath, but Amara could see it now, the machinery humming to life. Greg blinked, startled. "Hostile?" "Yes," Clara said firmly, her gaze shifting toward Amara just long enough to wound. Her tone, her behavior, "I think it's making everyone uncomfortable." Amara turned her head then, slowly and deliberately, her eyes locking onto Clara's with a steadiness that refused to waver. "Uncomfortable?" Amara repeated softly. The word, stripped of Clara's pretense, hung there like a challenge. Clara straightened, emboldened by Greg's hesitation. "You heard me." Greg glanced toward Amara, clearly unsure of himself. "Miss Hayes, is there?" "No." The word was final, and Greg flinched. Amara kept her voice even, though something deep within her began to stir a familiar anger, worn smooth by years of endurance. She had seen this game before. Paint the black woman as hostile, as a threat, and wait for the world to do the rest. "I have not spoken to this woman since she sat down," Amara said, her voice calm but cutting. "If she feels uncomfortable, it's not because of my behavior. It's because she doesn't like what I represent." The words landed like blows. Clara's cheeks flushed crimson, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. She opened her mouth, but Amara was not finished. "You can't demand comfort when it comes at the expense of someone else's dignity," Amara said, the fire in her voice flickering but controlled. if you don't feel safe, Mrs. Whitman, it's because you've built a world where my presence is a threat to you." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Amara had ever heard. Greg shifted awkwardly, his gaze flickering between the two women, his training clearly failing him. He muttered something about checking with the supervisor and retreated toward the galley, leaving Clara to stew in her indignation. From across the aisle, Mr. Jameson, the older man who had grumbled earlier, decided to insert himself once again. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "but some of us paid for a quiet flight. You ladies might want to settle this so we can all move on." Amara turned her gaze to him, her expression cool and unreadable. "Is my existence disturbing your peace, sir?" Jameson shifted uncomfortably, but his tone stayed sharp. "You don't need to make it about that." "About what?" Amara asked quietly. "Go ahead, say it." Jameson's mouth snapped shut, and he turned his attention back to the in-flight magazine in his lap. In the moments that followed, the tension in the cabin became something alive, something that crept between the rows, curling around the passengers like a mist. It wasn't about a seat anymore. It never had been. Amara turned back toward the window, her face impassive, but her heart beat steadily in her chest. She had seen it all laid bare now. The ease with which Clara had called her hostile. The way Greg had looked for a way out. The silence of the others who watched but said nothing. It was always the same. She thought the world would bend over backward to protect its comfort, even at the cost of its soul. The truth of the matter was simple. Clara Whitman didn't fear Amara's behavior. She feared Amara's presence, because Amara was proof that the boundaries Clara had built around power, around privilege, around who belonged and who didn't were no longer impenetrable. And that, Amara knew, terrified her. Deborah Lane reappeared, her face carefully blank. "Miss Hayes," she said softly, her voice rehearsed, "the captain would like to have a word with you before we proceed." The cabin inhaled as one, waiting for Amara's response. Amara closed her notebook, her movements slow and deliberate. "Lead the way," she said. She rose, her posture straight, her presence commanding. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt their eyes on her, not just Clara's, but everyone's, watching, judging, waiting for the moment when Amara Hayes would become the thing they had already decided she was. But Amara walked past them all, her chin lifted, her steps steady. If this was a battle, they had chosen the wrong woman. Because Amara Hayes had spent her whole life walking through doors that others tried to close. Amara Hayes followed Deborah Lane down the narrow aisle, the path carved through the center of the first-class cabin where judgment sat upright in every seat. Eyes cut toward her sharp, curious, disapproving before retreating behind magazines and screens. As if to say, "We're not part of this." But they were. Amara knew. Silence was always part of it. She kept her steps even and her shoulders squared. Dignity, her mother once told her, was the armor you carried when the world demanded you kneel. She walked not just for herself now but for every ghost that had ever been told, "You do not belong." The galley curtain swayed softly as Deborah pulled it aside, revealing a small space just before the cockpit. The captain stood waiting, a white man in his 50s. His uniform immaculate, his posture commanding, a man whose presence seemed designed to impose order. He looked at Amara with a neutrality that was more studied than natural, as if he were determined not to let his opinion slip before she spoke. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice firm but polite. "I'm Captain Harris." Amara inclined her head, unbothered by the authority he wore like a second skin. "Captain." Deborah stepped back, glancing nervously between them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The captain took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully, as men like him always did. "I've been informed there's a disagreement between you and another passenger." "It's not a disagreement," Amara replied smoothly. "It's a demand that I give up my seat to someone who believes they're entitled to it." Captain Harris shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to betray his discomfort. He glanced at Deborah as if to confirm the facts. But Deborah remained silent. It was a delicate thing. What they were doing here, a dance to decide how far they could push her before she pushed back. "You see, Miss Hayes," Harris continued, "we want to ensure all passengers feel safe and comfortable." "Safe," Amara repeated, letting the word linger in the air. "Has my presence here threatened anyone's safety, Captain?" He paused, caught off guard, and Amara pressed forward before he could recover. Or are you telling me that Mrs. Whitman's comfort is worth more than mine?" The question hung between them like a storm cloud. For the first time, the captain's carefully constructed mask began to crack. "No one is saying that," he replied tightly. "But that's exactly what you're saying." Amara shot back, her voice even but unrelenting. "You're saying that if one person makes enough noise, if one person complains loudly enough, they can have what they want. Even if it's not theirs to take. You're saying I should make myself smaller, quieter, to appease someone who refuses to accept my existence in this space." Deborah looked down at her shoes, her silence growing heavier by the second. Captain Harris stiffened, his authority bruised. "We're just trying to de-escalate the situation." Amara's laugh was soft, bitter. "De-escalation," she said, "is always asked of the person with the least power." There it was. Then the truth laid bare. The captain looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Truly seeing her, and finding himself unprepared for what he saw. Men like him, Amara knew, were used to control, to compliance, but she was not here to comply. "If I may ask, Captain," Amara continued, her voice measured, "what happens if I refuse? If I insist on staying in the seat I paid for?" Captain Harris frowned. "Let's not make this into something bigger than it needs to be." "Miss Hayes, it already is," she replied quietly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. Captain Harris looked at her, then at Deborah, then back again, as if searching for an answer that would restore the balance of power he so clearly felt slipping away. Finally, he sighed. "You're within your rights to remain in your seat," he admitted reluctantly. "Good," Amara replied. "Then this conversation is over." As Amara turned to leave, a voice cut through the curtain behind her, sharp and unmistakable. "Is she being removed?" Clara Whitman stood just beyond the galley, her arms crossed, her face twisted into a mask of righteous anger. Her companion hovered behind her, small and silent. "No," Captain Harris replied curtly. Clara's face reddened, her composure slipping further. "I cannot believe this. After everything I've said, after how uncomfortable she's made me, you're just going to let this go?" "I suggest you return to your seat, Mrs. Whitman," the captain said, his voice carrying an edge now. Clara didn't move. She glared at Amara, her gaze laced with a venom that no longer bothered to hide itself. "Women like you," she spat, her voice trembling, "always think you can play the victim. You think the rules don't apply to you." Amara turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Clara's with a quiet fire. "No," she said softly. "I think the rules have always applied differently to me. And I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Clara's mouth opened, but no words came. Deborah stepped forward then, her voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Whitman, please take your seat. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to call security." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're threatening me?" "No," Deborah said, her voice steady now, as though she had finally found the edge of her own patience. "I'm asking you to comply. Just like everyone else." Clara turned toward her companion, as if to rally support, but found none. The woman beside her simply looked away, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. The moment had passed. With a huff, Clara spun on her heel and stormed back to her seat, her footsteps loud and deliberate. The cabin fell into a hush so deep it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. As she returned to seat 1A, Amara felt every eye on her, their gazes heavy with something they could not name. She sat down, opened her notebook, and turned to a fresh page. This, she thought, was the nature of the battle. It was not about a seat or a drink or a glance. It was about how far you were willing to go to hold your ground. It was about the weight of the invisible, the rules, the whispers, the unspoken expectations, and whether you would allow yourself to be crushed by it. Amara lifted her pen, her movements slow and deliberate, and began to write. The plane shuddered as it climbed into the night sky, leaving the earth behind, and for the first time in hours, Amara felt herself exhale, not in relief, but in resolve. It was the quiet after a storm that unsettled Amara Hayes the most, not the chaos itself, but the stillness that came afterward. The silence in the first-class cabin felt like a room where no one dared breathe. The kind of silence that follows a hard truth when no one has the courage to speak its name. The plane had steadied now, its engines humming softly as it carved a path through the darkening sky. Outside the window, The last traces of the sun had disappeared, leaving nothing but shadows. Amara's reflection stared back at her steady, unflinching, and still. She had won the battle. She supposed. She was still in seat 1A. Clara Whitman was back in 3B. Quiet but festering. The captain had relented. Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor, had returned to her duties, though her steps seemed heavier now, as though she carried a burden she could not name. And yet Amara felt no victory in it. To win one battle meant nothing when the war was endless. A flight attendant, a different one this time. A black woman named Renee appeared at Amara's side. Her smile soft, her voice low. "Miss Hayes," Renee said, "can I get you something to drink?" Amara looked at her, her expression unreadable. She saw the sincerity in Renee's eyes, the careful professionalism masking something more, solidarity, perhaps, or understanding. "No, thank you," Amara said softly. "I'm fine." Renee lingered for a moment longer than necessary, as though debating whether to say more, then nodded and moved on. It would have ended there. Amara thought should have ended there. But the problem with silence is that it rarely lasts. From behind her came the faint sound of Clara Whitman's voice again. Her words muffled but unmistakable. "I don't know why she's still here," Clara whispered to her companion, though she knew full well she could be heard. "She's making everyone uncomfortable. You'd think people would have the decency to know their place." Amara's pen froze mid-sentence. Know their place. The words ignited something deep within her, a familiar burn she had felt her entire life. She closed her notebook slowly, carefully, and turned her head just enough to look back over her shoulder. Clara met her gaze this time, though her eyes were hard, defiant. "Do you have something to say, Mrs. Whitman?" Amara asked, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of thunder. Clara blinked, startled by the directness, but recovered quickly. "I wasn't speaking to you," she said. "But you were speaking about me," Amara replied. The cabin fell still again, every passenger holding their breath, watching. Some of them looked at Amara with quiet sympathy, others with discomfort, and a few like Mr. Jameson with barely concealed irritation, as though Amara's refusal to yield had disrupted something sacred. "You don't need to make a scene," Clara said, though her voice trembled just slightly. "A scene?" Amara repeated, her brow arching. "Is that what this is? A black woman sitting in a seat she paid for, that's a scene to you?" Clara's cheeks flushed, her lips curling. "Don't twist my words. I don't need to," Amara said, turning fully now, her voice gaining strength. "Your words speak for themselves. People like me know your place. You think this is about a seat, Mrs. Whitman? It's not. It's about the fact that I am here, in a space you decided doesn't belong to me." Clara's companion looked down at her hands, avoiding the exchange entirely. The others remained silent, their gazes flickering between Amara and Clara like spectators at a duel. Deborah appeared again, summoned by the tension in the air. She stepped into the aisle, her voice carefully neutral. "Ladies, please." Amara turned to her sharply. "No, Ms. Lane, not this time. I won't let you smooth this over and pretend it didn't happen." "Not for her comfort," Deborah faltered, her authority wilting. "I just need—" "No," Amara interrupted, her voice steady. "You don't need me to calm down. You don't need me to be quiet so everyone else can feel comfortable pretending this isn't happening. What you need is to ask Mrs. Whitman why she feels so threatened by my presence." Deborah's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she looked at Clara with something like doubt, something Amara thought might even be shame. Clara's voice, when it came, was sharp and brittle. "I'm not threatened," she snapped. "I just don't think it's too much to ask for a little respect." "Respect," Amara repeated, her voice like ice. "Do you know how much respect it takes to sit quietly while people like you question my right to exist in this space? Do you know how much restraint it takes to not become the thing you already believe I am?" Clara's expression faltered, her hands curling into fists. "I don't know what you mean." "You don't have to," Amara said. "That's the luxury you live with, Mrs. Whitman. You don't have to see it. You don't have to name it. You just have to feel it. And the world rushes to fix it for you." The silence that followed was different now, thicker, heavier. It was no longer the silence of denial but the silence of a truth no one could unsee. Mr. Jameson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman across the aisle, white, middle-aged, looked down at her hands, her face pinched with something like guilt. Amara saw it all, felt it all, but gave no ground. Finally, Clara sat back in her seat, her face pale with anger, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She had nothing left to say. And Amara knew it. Deborah cleared her throat. "Miss Hayes, if there's anything we can do to. You can stop asking me to fix what I didn't break," Amara said quietly. Deborah nodded, her face tight with understanding, and turned away. Amara sat back in seat 1A, the fire still burning in her chest. She looked out the window into the darkness beyond, where the night sky stretched wide and infinite. She had not come here to fight, but the fight had come to her as it always did. What mattered now was not the seat, not even the words that had been said, but the truth that had been laid bare. They could not unsee her now, could not pretend this had not happened. And that, Amara thought, was enough for now, because sometimes, the only victory you could claim was refusing to disappear. The air in the first-class cabin had changed. Amara Hayes could feel it dense, thick with a charge that made it hard to breathe. It was the kind of silence that came after a battle no one wanted to name but everyone knew had been fought. Her seat, 1A, felt like a throne and a target all at once. For the rest of the passengers, it was easier to pretend that nothing had happened, that Clara Whitman had not said what she said, that Amara had not forced the truth into the open. But Amara knew that pretending was itself a luxury, one she had never been granted. The lights had dimmed now, the cabin cloaked in shadows. A quiet descended, unnatural and fragile, as if the slightest sound might shatter it. Amara's gaze rested on the window, where the darkness outside stretched vast and indifferent. She thought of her mother's hands, calloused, firm, steady, pressing her shoulders and saying, "You belong wherever your feet stand." But belonging, Amara had learned, was not about what you believed. It was about what the world allowed you to believe. Somewhere behind her, Clara shifted in her seat. Amara did not need to turn to see her. She could feel the woman's presence, sharp, unsettled, like a splinter beneath the skin. It was not enough for Clara to retreat to silence, it never was. The Claras of the world could not abide losing, because their world was built on never having to. The hum of the engines was the only sound until Mr. Jameson, the older man in 2B, decided to speak again. "Unbelievable," he muttered, not quietly this time. "What happened to decency? To knowing your place?" The words struck Amara like a blow, not because they surprised her but because they didn't. The man spoke what others dared not say aloud. The lie of civility was stripped bare, and what remained was the raw, ugly truth. Amara turned her head, slow and deliberate, and looked at Mr. Jameson. He froze, his mouth still open, caught like a child caught stealing candy. "I know my place, sir," Amara said softly. "Do you?" The old man flushed crimson, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He looked away, suddenly fascinated by the in-flight safety card in his lap. Around him, others looked down, their gazes flickering to the floor, to their hands, anywhere but at Amara. The flight attendant, Greg, reappeared then, as if drawn to the tension like a moth to a flame. He stood at the front of the cabin, uncertain of himself, his voice tight with forced authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Greg said, "let's try to settle in for the remainder of the flight. If there are any concerns, please let me know." He looked at Amara then, just for a moment, as though pleading with her to comply. To make it easier for everyone. Amara met his gaze and held it, unflinching. Make it easier. It was always the same ask. Be quiet. Be small. Be invisible. Amara had spent too many years being easier for other people. Not today. Then Clara's voice rose, breaking the uneasy quiet. "I'm not the problem here," Clara said, her voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been nothing but reasonable. It's her attitude." Amara turned fully now, the fire she had kept banked suddenly roaring to life. "My attitude?" Clara's mouth opened, but Amara didn't let her speak. "You think this is about my attitude, Mrs. Whitman?" Amara's voice carried through the cabin, low and clear, slicing through the shadows like a blade. "Let me tell you what this is really about. This is about how you cannot bear the sight of me sitting here. Because it reminds you that the world is changing. That people like me, black women, women who fought and clawed for their place, are not asking anymore. We are taking our place, whether you like it or not." Clara's face turned pale, her composure cracking. You don't have to say it," Amara said, her voice steady but sharp. "I see it. I've seen it my whole life. The way you look at me. The way you weaponize words like hostile and uncomfortable. You think this seat was meant for you because the world taught you that everything is. But not this time. Not today. The cabin was silent, and in that silence, Amara could feel the weight of her words sinking in. The passengers sat frozen, each one complicit, whether they knew it or not. Even Greg looked stricken, his professionalism faltering in the face of a truth too large to ignore. Amara turned her gaze to the window again, her breath steady, her resolve unbroken. She had not raised her voice, had not screamed or cried, but she had spoken, and the walls of the cabin seemed smaller now, as if they too could not contain what had just been said. When the plane landed hours later, the passengers disembarked one by one. Clara walked briskly down the aisle, her head held high, but Amara saw the truth in the way her hands trembled at her sides. Mr. Jameson avoided her eyes entirely. His footsteps hurried, as though trying to escape the weight of what he had witnessed. Greg lingered at the door, waiting as Amara approached. For the first time, his mask slipped. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "I am sorry." Amara paused, her expression softening just slightly. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Be better." Greg nodded, swallowing hard, as if the words had struck something deep within him. Amara stepped off the plane into the blinding lights of the terminal, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The world outside moved as it always had, fast, indifferent, unthinking, but Amara felt the shift within herself. Subtle but real. She had not asked for this fight, but she had fought anyway. And perhaps that was the lesson. She thought, you cannot change the world in a single day. You cannot force it to see what it refuses to look at. But you can stand firm, unshakable, and refuse to disappear. Amara exhaled slowly, the tension easing from her shoulders as she stepped into the crowd. Belonging, she realized, was not something the world could give her. It was something she carried within herself, uncompromising, undeniable, and hers. And for now, that was enough.